There's an egregious misconception I noticed among English-speaking anime fans when it comes to talking about the rise of real robots over super robots in anime. For some reason, the super robot shows that dominated anime in the 70s are always portrayed as kid-friendly spectacles invented just to sell toys with scant innovation for the entirety of the decade, only for Mobile Suit Gundam to uproot the genre and turn everything into a gritty military drama. Watching through YouTube videos on the history of mecha anime, you'll notice it's a common practice to jump from Mazinger to Mobile Suit Gundam. This sentiment that super robot shows of the era had so little innovation that Gundam should be the next step in their evolution is not only cringe as fuck, but completely undermines the cultural and economic changes in Japan during that time that shaped Japanese media. Not to mention the internal politics within the industry itself that dictated what kinds of shows were made when and by who. Mobile Suit Gundam changed the game for sure, but it wasn't something that came out of left field. The series was built on themes established by its predecessors in the genre, and I'm not exclusively talking about Space Battleship Yamato. To understand how the mecha genre evolved, we have to first look at where it started, and I'm controversially not talking about Tetsujin. In 1971, anime was dying. The number of anime in production were dwindling, and in the years leading up to this, even shows that pulled in high ratings were struggling to make a profit. In April of '71, Toei's television department premiered Kamen Rider, a series that would revolutionize Japanese pop culture and revive the then failing TV tokusatsu genre. A few weeks after Kamen Rider premiered, Ultraman returned from a 3-year hiatus in a series titled Return of Ultraman. The live-action special effects industry was a powerhouse once again, and children were ignoring anime in favor of special effects superheroes. Also, the 1968 and 1969 bankruptcies of Marusan Shoten and Imai, two of the biggest producers of anime-related merchandise, probably didn't help. Veteran anime writer Masaki Tsuji described the situation bluntly in a 2007 interview when he said, "TV anime was on the verge of extinction." Internally, Toei's animation department was desperate for a hit to bring anime back into the spotlight, as there were genuine concerns that Toei would shut down their animation department, known at the time as Toei Doga. The solution was to develop shows that took full advantage of the medium of animation, featuring extraordinary and supernatural feats that couldn't be accomplished in a live-action television show. Toei had several meetings with Go Nagai, a famous author of gag manga at the time, whose manga Harenshi Gakuen had already been adapted into 4 films and a 27-episode TV series. At the time, Go Nagai and Toei were working on the pre-production of Devilman when Nagai pitched Mazinger Z. Mazinger Z was a giant robot work in the same vein as Mitsutaro Yokoyama's Tetsujin 28 or Giant Robo. However, Mazinger would increase the drama and tension by having the main character pilot the mech like a vehicle, instead of controlling it from afar. The project was initially met with skepticism, but after Mazinger Z began airing, Toei and their sponsors were shocked, because kids loved it. But why? In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a period of drastic evolution for anime and manga. This was the age of the Gekiga movement, a shift towards more realistic art and deeper storytelling, where Japanese artists pushed against the stigma that manga was just entertainment for children. The anime of the era reflected this, with titles like Lupin III, Ashita no Joe, and Ryu the Primitive Boy, the latter of which, despite being about a cave boy fighting dinosaurs, is overtly a series about Japanese racism.
白い肌の粉と生む呪われた女など俺の知ったことか。
なぜだ。白い肌がどうしていけない。同じ人間じゃないか。
うるさい。
These shows are revered with prestige today, but when they aired they were costly productions and struggled to make their money back. What Mazinger Z did was combine the fantasy and sci-fi elements of classic manga with the detailed art and unrestrained nature of modern manga. And Mazinger Z would draw heavily from these works. Don't get me wrong, the series was aimed at kids, but it was also still a series made by Go Nagai, a name synonymous with pushing boundaries. For example, anime was filled with male and female hero duos at that time, but Mazinger's Koji Kabuto and Sayaka Yumi stand out because unlike other pairings, Koji and Sayaka fight. And when I say fight, I mean physically. Sayaka Yumi's sense of agency and her hot-blooded nature have led her to be cited as one of anime's earliest examples of a strong female character, as well as the less impressive title of the first tsundere character. Mazinger wasn't trying to hit an older demographic like Joe or Lupin, but it still didn't hold back. Characters in Mazinger, good and bad, die, often brutally. Great Mazinger would take this a step further and introduce the character Jun Hono, a half-Japanese, half-black pilot who was bullied throughout her life due to her dark skin, to the point that she even tried scrubbing her skin until it bled. While the real robots of the late 70s and 80s did present stories and characters that challenged viewers, that doesn't mean super robot shows didn't, and these innovations carried the attention of children back to anime. One of the greatest benefits for Go Nagai and his team at Dynamic Planning was that, unlike Tetsujin, they had the hindsight of the kaiju boom of the 60s. The kaiju boom, as its name implies, was the explosion of giant monster movies produced in Japan following the success of Godzilla, and because of these films, Dynamic Planning had a good idea of what kids wanted to see from a show about giant robots fighting monsters. In fact, Mazinger's name, evil appearance, and his reputation as a punisher of evil is more than likely an homage to the 1960s film series Daimajin, which was about a giant stone statue that comes to life to punish evil. One of the greatest obstacles for those films was that they were very expensive to produce due to their large sets, expensive miniatures, and costly special effects, all of which could be done more cheaply and cleanly in animation, making Mazinger a series with all the benefits of the kaiju boom without any of the drawbacks. Mazinger also introduced concepts that would become staples in the mecha genre, like adding new equipment and power-ups, such as the Scrander, which allows Mazinger to fly, and the photon rockets introduced in episode 18, giving Mazinger the ability to jump 500 meters in the air and jet through water. Mazinger's sponsor was a company called Popy, who produced two lines of toys to promote the series, the Chogokin line and the Jumbo Machinder line. The Chogokin line, named for the super alloy Chogokin Z, which Mazinger Z was said to be built from, were a line of die-cast metal toys with articulated joints and action features like rocket-punching fists. The Jumbo Machinder line were 24-inch plastic figures with similar action features, and both were massive hits, contributing to Popy's complete domination of Japanese toy aisles. The success of the toy line and the Mazinger Z anime would lead to the series running for 2 years, ending with 92 episodes, as well as Mazinger appearing in a handful of Toei's summer films. In 1974, Toei, Popy, Dynamic Planning, and Fuji TV would team up to produce two new super robot shows, the sequel to Mazinger titled Great Mazinger, and Getter Robo. Getter Robo was another major innovation for the mecha genre, as the anime featured 3 ships that could combine in different sequences to form 3 different robots, expanding Popy's line of figures and becoming anime's first combiner mech. Getter Robo was even darker than Mazinger and portrayed its main characters as hot-blooded renegades fighting a bloody and often disturbing war for the fate of the Earth, with much heavier political overtones. In the manga, unlike Toei's adaptation of Mazinger, Getter Robo definitely feels like it was toned down to hit a particular demographic. Not that the show isn't worth watching, it's still a fun story with great animation, like this fight scene in episode 11 animated by Kazuhide Tomonaga, best known for animating the car chase from Castle of Cagliostro and the opening to Batman the Animated Series. But it is a completely different tone than Ken Ishikawa's manga. On the subject of animation, there's also 4 episodes towards the end of the series animated by Yoshinori Kanada. Kanada is known as Japan's first rockstar animator, whose flashy action animation would go on to inspire the works of Studio Gainax and Trigger. This includes one episode he worked on where Getter Robo has to fight the dinosaur empire deep inside a volcano, which would have been a cool concept if they didn't just steal it from Evangelion. Jeez. In 1974, while Getter Robo was still airing, the Mazinger staff would move to working on the sequel series Great Mazinger. By this point, the Getter and Mazinger series were massive hits for Toei, Popy, and Fuji TV, but it was in 1975 where we'd see a division arise within this collective. Mazinger's second sequel series, UFO Robot Grendizer, premiered in October of 1975. Grendizer was inspired by the rising popularity of UFOs and ancient civilizations, and you'll notice from this point onwards that a lot of anime I mentioned will depict enemies in flying saucers, or will open with images of Stonehenge, Moai heads, or the Nazca lines. Fun fact also, the enemy seen in episodes 52 and 53, King Gori, who's based on a giant gorilla wearing armor, is believed to have inspired the Saiyan armor worn in Dragon Ball Z. Despite being the next title in the Mazinger series, Grendizer wasn't being worked on by the animation staff behind Great Mazinger. Instead, Toei used the team from Getter Robo while the Mazinger staff were developing a new robot show titled Steel Jeeg, which omitted 2 of the major parties in the previous network, Fuji TV and Popy. Steel Jeeg premiered on the same day as Grendizer on NET and was about a giant piloted robot who could detach his limbs at the joints and reform himself using magnets. The series was sponsored by toy company Takara, who was in direct competition with Popy's Grendizer. That Christmas, Popy ran into trouble as they struggled designing the mechanism that would attach the Grendizer robot toy to its saucer, and as a result, the toy was delayed and didn't make it to shelves in time for the holiday season. Takara's Magne Robo Steel Jeeg became the toy to have Christmas of 1975, and Popy saw this as a betrayal. The company who once stood uncontested in the field of robot toys now not only had competition, but their competition was winning. And to Popy, it was all the fault of Go Nagai. Popy's grudge against Dynamic Planning would see Jeeg excluded from what had become a tradition among Toei mecha shows, the summer crossover films. Every summer, Toei would create original films that saw Dynamic Planning characters crossing over into each other's universe to fight against a new enemy. These films were huge events and were highly anticipated by children in the early 70s. In 1976, Toei released Grendizer, Robo G, and Great Mazinger, Battle, the Giant Sea Monster. This film was intended as a finale to Go Nagai's robot series, with Go Nagai even trying to convince Toei to allow him to include Devilman, Cutie Honey, Enma-kun, and Jeeg, so all of Dynamic Planning's TV animation characters could appear on screen together. But Toei shot the idea down, stating it would take additional effort to include those characters since they were from different TV networks, while Grendizer, Great Mazinger, and Robo G were all airing on Fuji TV. Regardless, the movie was a great success, so much so that Toei greenlit another crossover movie, despite this one being positioned as the Great Send-Off. The movie was titled UFO Robot Grendizer, Steel Jeeg, and Robo G, but before the film could be animated, it was cancelled due to Popy's protest about their robot appearing alongside Takara's. A script was finished and the story was adapted into a 4-page comic titled Grendizer vs. Steel Jeeg, but the two would never meet on the big screen. Toei and Fuji TV would continue to produce giant robot shows, but without Go Nagai, both to appease their sponsors and so they wouldn't have to deal with having to send Dynamic Planning huge royalty checks. Following the finale of Robo G, Toei created a new robot series titled Gai King, featuring many of the themes and design elements that had become staples for the giant robot genre. There was a problem though. Go Nagai claimed that Gai King's design was too similar to Mazinger and Grendizer, and threatened to take Toei to court over copyright infringement. Toei opted to avoid going to court and gave Dynamic Planning a creative credit on Gai King. But despite giving Go Nagai a credit in the final version of the show, Gai King really would represent the end of an era for giant robot anime. From 1972 to 1975, Go Nagai, Ken Ishikawa, and the team of creatives at Dynamic Planning were the kings of robot anime. But they weren't the only names making headway in the industry. In 1972, Tatsunoko background artist Kunio Okawara would be placed in charge of drawing the mecha for the anime Science Ninja Team Gatchaman. Okawara would receive the first industry credit as a mechanical designer, and he and his boss, art director Mitsuki Nakamura, would found Tatsunoko design studio Mecha Man, designing robots and sci-fi vehicles for many of Tatsunoko's most popular anime during the era. By 1976, Mecha Man would break off from Tatsunoko, though they'd maintain a healthy relationship designing many of the studio's iconic mechs and vehicles. In fact, only a few days after Toei premiered Gai King, Tatsunoko premiered a new robot anime in collaboration with Takara and mech designer Kunio Okawara. Gawappa 5 Godam would hold a place in anime history as Tatsunoko's first giant robot show, and the first mecha anime to feature a female as the main character and the leader of a team. But unfortunately, the series was in a ratings battle with Toei's Grendizer as well as a popular game show, and the show ended as a huge flop. A few months later, in September of '76, Takara would reveal a new collaboration with Toei, serving as a spiritual successor to Steel Jeeg, titled Magne Robo Gakkin. Magne Robo Gakkin is notable for having a mech piloted by a man and a woman who were equal parts the main character, and this duality between a male and female sharing the role as a protagonist was a huge point in the promoting of the series, with the anime magazine Uchuusen describing the main robot as a robot that has both the strength of a man and the kindness of a woman on the surface, with the violence of a man and the cruelty of a woman on the inside. To put it lightly, the relationship between Toei, Popy, and Dynamic Planning was not what it used to be, and Popy would find success working directly with Toei on Gai King, as well as with Studio Soeisha on their robot anime Brave Raidin. Brave Raidin was a huge series for Popy and mecha anime in general. Unlike previous giant robots who were built by scientists in universe, the titular Raidin was actually a robot-like god from an ancient civilization, a story element created to help the show stand out from Mazinger. Raidin's main gimmick was its ability to transform into a jet, a transformation which, unlike Robo's, could be accurately recreated by the Chogokin figure. Raidin had two directors and both would become very important names in mecha, Tadao Nagahama and Yoshiyuki Tomino. With the success of Raidin's Chogokin and Jumbo Machinder toys, Popy would collaborate on a project that joined both Soeisha and Toei on a mecha trilogy that saw Nagahama at the helm, known today as the Robot Romance Trilogy. These series were Combattler V, Voltes 5, and Tosho Daimos. Combattler V was still a Monster of the Week show, but featured greater character development, especially among the villains. Despite not being canonically connected, one mainstay of the Robot Romance trilogy was the inclusion of a tragic villain, who despite being a different character in each series, was always voiced by Osamu Ichikawa. Combattler drew some inspiration from Robo being a combiner mech piloted by a team, but was designed in a way so that the transformation could be properly replicated in the toy. As you can imagine by now, that was a common criticism leveraged at Robo. Combattler V and all the entries in the Robot Romance trilogy were created by Saburo Yatsude, a pseudonym for Toei's internal writing staff. Saburo Yatsude would also later be credited as the creator of the Super Sentai series, and a lot of Sentai's tropes can be seen in these series, such as the use of combiner mechs, teams with color-coded uniforms, and extended scenes of comical or melodramatic interplay between the villains. Meanwhile, Go Nagai would team up with Knack Productions to release Grendizer X. Knack Productions is a somewhat controversial studio, known for their low production value and often so bad it's funny output, such as the infamous Chargeman Ken. According to Knack's president, Kiyoshi Nishino, Go Nagai originally wanted Grendizer X to be produced by Toei, but after his falling out, he would bring it to Knack. Futabasha's Go Nagai TV Anime Encyclopedia paints a different picture, stating that the series was already in development at Knack, who approached dynamic planning after the incident for help bringing the show together, and for help producing a serialized manga version. Grendizer X flopped miserably, and unfortunately dynamic planning would continue to release low quality, if not at least somewhat interesting works with Knack, like the 1976 live-action tokusatsu series Battlehawk. In 1977, Toei replaced Go Nagai with Leiji Matsumoto of Space Battleship Yamato fame, creating Vanguard Ace. Vanguard Ace actually sported really high production value with high-quality animation by Toei Studio No. 1, and the show wound up doing very well. However, Matsumoto would opt out of creating more robot shows with Toei, as he wasn't a huge fan of the giant robot genre in general, and mostly agreed to make the show as a means of greasing the wheels on getting an animated adaptation of his Captain Harlock manga. Meanwhile, Soeisha, who were disappointed with the fact that most of their profits were going to their parent company, Tohoku Shinsha, made a deal with toy company Clover, who agreed to sponsor 3 anime projects, affording the studio the freedom to break away from their parent company and produce more original anime, without having to rely on subcontracting work. The studio renamed itself Nippon Sunrise, and their first project under the new name was a series titled Zambot 3. Zambot 3 follows 3 clans of alien children who flee their home planet Beale after it was destroyed by the alien entity Gaizok. While trying to start new lives on Earth, Gaizok invade, so the children must use 3 vehicles that can combine into the robot Zambot 3 to fight off the invaders. Zambot 3 is where we see a huge leap in the themes and tone of mecha anime, with Zambot 3 giving us some of the earliest examples of psychological introspection in the genre. The show often portrayed its battles as horrific, often cutting to civilians running from debris. There was an emphasis on human suffering and the collateral damage these battles caused. Episode 13 is famous for a scene where the main character Kappe becomes frozen at the sight of refugees being blown up by a Gaizok mecha boost. Episode 16 would see the introduction of one of the series' most infamous elements, the human bombs. The episode sees the Gaizok abducting humans and planting time bombs in them, then releasing them, turning them into unknowing suicide bombers. But beyond all of that, the most famous aspect of Zambot 3 is probably the ending. In the final episode of the series, during a battle in space, 2 of Zambot 3's child pilots, Uchuta and Keiko, are killed. The ending would earn series director Yoshiyuki Tomino the moniker Kill 'em all Tomino, and confused and disgusted the toy sponsors. I wouldn't be surprised if this response to Zambot 3 is why the second series from Sunrise would lean way more heavily into comedy. Daitarn 3 was a robot show but drew more heavily from spy thrillers and American comic books, but more specifically it feels like a parody of robot anime, spy thrillers, and American comic books. The series features mech designs from Kunio Okawara, who at the time was best known for making the colorful toyetic mechs and vehicles seen in Tatsunoka's popular Time Boken series. And you can see the influence from Time Boken not just in the mech designs, but in the overall tone of the show. Unfortunately, Daitarn wouldn't sell as well as Zambot, at least not domestically, and Sunrise would only have one more chance to produce a hit anime before they'd be forced to return to subcontracting work. Due to the success of the Space Battleship Yamato film, Sunrise decided to make a series with a serialized story that could be adapted into a feature film like Yamato, hoping that the success of the film would make it so Sunrise could continue producing their own original anime. The fate of the studio depended on Sunrise's next original anime, and that anime was called Freedom Fighter Gunboy. Later changed to Mobile Suit Gundam. Mobile Suit Gundam combined the realism of war scene in Zambot 3 and the serialized storytelling and military backdrop of Space Battleship Yamato, creating something that felt truly original to the mecha genre. Gundam was a show that didn't portray self-sacrifice as heroic or honorable. It was traumatizing and led to confusion and anger. While other mecha anime used alien invaders as their antagonists, the villains of Gundam were humans who were exiled to outer space by Earth's government. They wage a war against the Earth seeking independence, but in doing so have committed atrocities that have resulted in the loss of millions of innocent lives. Unlike previous mecha shows, the robots in Gundam were military weapons, mostly of practical color and designs, or at least they tried to. At the time, there were 2 major mech design studios, the previously mentioned Mecha Man and Studio Nue. Unlike Mecha Man's colorful toyetic designs, Studio Nue was known for their grounded, realistic designs and their high attention to detail. Surprisingly, of the 2 studios, Sunrise hired Kunio Okawara of Mecha Man. However, his art style clearly clashed with the tone director Yoshiyuki Tomino was going for.
面と向かってあんたのデザインは嫌いだよっていうのは何回も聞いてるし、なぜっていうと鈍感だから。私は鈍感でいいと思ってるんで、そのアニメーターに形を正確に伝えるためにはね。これはもう主義の違いで。
Unfortunately, the show started off on unstable ground, receiving a time slot of Saturdays at 5:30 p.m. Ratings skewed low, and the story wasn't conducive for selling toys. Partway through the initial run, though, the series picked up steam, and the soundtrack's vinyl record would become a bestseller. This proved that while the series didn't resonate with young children, teenagers and sci-fi enthusiasts loved it. After the series ended, Bandai saw major success with the sale of Gundam plastic models. Unlike toys, plastic models were something you assembled, painted, and posed yourself. Because of the skill required, they weren't popular with children, but were very popular with teenagers and enthusiasts, the main demographic of Gundam. Something that I'm surprised a lot of people never talk about is how it's way easier to sell plastic models than toys. Toy sales, especially with robot anime, are very cut and dry. When a show is popular on TV, kids want to buy the robot from that show. When that show is over, kids generally lose interest and move on to the next robot. However, since plastic models hit an older audience, not only do they have more money to spend, but they're also willing to buy model kits for shows that might not be on TV anymore, or they may have never even heard of. It's also worth mentioning that according to Mazinger composer Chume Watanabe, by the late 70s it was becoming much more common for record companies to sponsor anime, and this would lead to anime having bigger budgets as well as more emphasis on the music. This is one of the reasons why 70s anime openings are shouting about how strong your robot is, and 80s anime openings are pop songs that have nothing to do with the show at all. With the popularity of Gundam rising as the series entered nationwide syndication, plus the success of the plastic models and vinyl records, Sunrise greenlit the theatrical film, and the success of the film would turn Gundam into the massive, multimedia franchise it is today. The rise of Gundam and plastic models turned the industry's attention towards an older demographic, and real robots inspired by Gundam would come to dominate anime throughout the 80s. However, it would be misguided to say that super robots fell out of favor. In actuality, super robots were having their own little renaissance. Six Combination Godmars, for example, was a show planned to air for 24 episodes, but strong toy sales and a large, vocal female fan base led to the show being extended to 64 episodes and the creation of a feature film. Shin Tetsujin from 1980 is probably one of the most underrated mecha series I've seen. It continues the classic Monster of the Week format, but modernizes the characters and mech designs from Yokoyama's original work in a way that even impressed Yokoyama himself. Not to mention Gundam creator Yoshiyuki Tomino's own space runaway Ideon, a super robot that continues the path of Zambot 3 by psychologically torturing all those who pilot it. You see, I think the issue is that too many people see the real robot genre as the next evolutionary step in robot anime, when in actuality they're branching paths, and throughout the early 80s both subgenres would grow and mature. By the 90s, we'd even see super robots reclaim their status with Takara dropping the Brave series on us. And not to mention Yasuhiro Imagawa dropping some of the greatest super robot anime to exist, period, including that one Gundam that everyone who says they hate Gundam says, well, except that one. In conclusion, Gundam and real robots in general definitely innovated by popularizing serialized stories and the use of a military backdrop, but super robots were in no way dead and still managed to create innovative and influential shows. If I had to guess where the assumption of super robots just being colorful superheroes lacking real substance stems from, I'd say it's probably because of how the West was exposed to mecha anime through Voltron and Transformers. I always find it strange how many write mecha as a genre off entirely, usually offering the caveats of, except Evangelion, Gurren Lagann, and Code Geass, which usually just translates to, yeah, I like the ones I've seen, but the ones I haven't I assume are bad and stupid. As the man who coined the phrase when an anime YouTuber says unlike most mecha anime that focus on the robot, this one focuses on the characters, mocking how so many in the Anglosphere seem to not understand that regardless of aesthetic, the crux of storytelling is character drama, I think the first step in erasing these assumptions is learning about them.